All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Dr. Nikki Robinson. And this week we're going to be without my co host, Chris Hughes. But I do have another Chris here that we're going to be talking to. We're going to be chatting today with Chris Kulakowski. Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure.
Yeah. So for anyone that doesn't know you, can you give a brief introduction, who you are, what you do, and tell us what you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Chris Kulakowski. I work at IBM right now. I'm a threat hunter and detection engineer. My career spans about 12 years, spanning from data loss prevention to incident response to threat hunting. Now more of into like an engineering and strategic role, helping provide visibility enhancements to IBM.
Awesome. Yeah. So, can you give us a little bit for anyone that's not familiar with or is sort of familiar with like threat hunting and incident response, but you sort of have a background in both? Can you talk a little bit about maybe the differences in these areas? What interested you in these types of roles in the first place?
Certainly, yeah. So threat hunting and incident response are they have some similarities, but of course differences. The main thing is one is proactive, one is more reactive. Proactive, the threat hunting is a very proactive procedure or process. You know, you're consuming intelligence, you're looking in the environment, your environment, for any of these signals or indicators that you may have a compromise, and and then incident response is of course more reactive, right? You've got an indicator that you're compromised, and now you're reacting, doing the investigation, doing containment, doing response, and it even includes sometimes remediation, so getting the systems back up and running and operational. They do require different skill sets. Um, I would say both very technical roles. Incident response is more on the digital forensics side, where you're doing, of course, log analysis, but you're also very in tune with operating system internals and artifacts left behind from different activities that can take place in the system. With hunting, that it's more of an art, I would say. Each hunter is interpreting intelligence in their own way. You could read a threat report that comes out on the internet, and you could possibly interpret some of the indicators or behaviors that are observed in the threat report differently than another hunter, and you may hunt slightly in a slightly different way than another hunter would work. And there's no wrong or right way. In fact, I think that's what makes hunting such a really interesting career path. Is hunters have all different kinds of skill sets, and those skill sets show in the work that they're doing. Someone who comes from like a networking background may have a different lens on what they're hunting for than someone who comes from maybe a digital forensics or a military government background. They may know more about actor TTPs. Um, with incident response, I think it's more of a methodology. You're kind of doing a very systematic process of reviewing logs, looking at artifacts. You're trying to tell the story of what happened on that system. Whereas hunting is definitely not as systematic. It can very much be fluid depending on um, what threat you're hunting for, or what actor, what TTPs, etc. Um, so yeah, hopefully that helps. What interested me in these areas, I don't know. It's kind of just how my cards were dealt when I got into cybersecurity. I started in the digital forensics area, and so that kind of pushed me towards incident response naturally, because in incident response you're doing a lot of digital forensics, black box analysis, using a lot of forensic tools like FTK, NCASE, and it just kind of happened naturally. I enjoy it because you're looking for the needle in the haystack. Sometimes it can be a daunting task, but man, when you find the smoking gun, there's no better feeling. It's just really exciting, and it kind of fuels you for that next case. With threat hunting, similarly, how I enjoy incident response, just because you're looking for that needle in the haystack, and it's very rewarding. Um, Hunting is kind of, like I said, it's an art, so you can put your own spin on what you're doing essentially, and I enjoy that. It's not as systematic. You can kind of put your own flavor into hunting. A lot of our hunters here in IBM have different skill sets, and the nice thing about that is we learn from each other. We have experts in one query language where another expert may be uh, in a different query language, or maybe they're really good with log analysis, and we lean on each other to help fulfill the requirement of the hunt at hand.
Yeah, I love how you talked about the art form behind it, right? The creativity that we get to use. Because I think we talk a lot, especially about, cybersecurity as these very technical roles, which they are. But I love that you added that there is sort of this art form to it, this creative lens that we have to bring to it, because without that creativity, we'd sort of be doing the same thing over and over again, right? And potentially
Exactly.
missing things. So can you talk about, sort of how someone would be interested in maybe getting into whether it's threat hunting or detection engineering? Can you talk a little bit about career pathing, maybe where someone should start if they're interested in moving into this field?
Yeah, sure. I think that it's always good to have an IT background. I think that's kind of like a foundational skill set that everyone in cyber should have. You need to understand networking. You need to have basic knowledge of how operating systems work, and traditional logging on operating systems. I think that security operations fields are invaluable, extremely valuable experience to have in these fields. That way you can kind of get an idea of what's benign versus a true attack. Um, Getting hands-on experience in real compromises is always very good experience to have. That way you can kind of understand the the goals and intent behind an actor. Like, what are they doing? What kind of things do they um, look for when they're first getting access to a system? The commands that they're running, different techniques that they may leverage when they're compromising an environment. The more experience you have with dealing with real, true incidents, I think it equips that person, that analyst, with having the ability to identify something when you're looking through a ton of logs, and something quickly jumps out at you like, whoa, that's a little odd right there. That command doesn't seem like it's you know automated, doesn't seem like it's part of a script, or that looks like maybe that's hands-on keyboard activity. And I think that just comes with time and experience.
Yeah, I like that too, that you talk about that sort of real world experience, right? Chris and I have this conversation a lot with other guests and just with each other, where we talk about sort of the value of education, certifications, and real world experience, right? So having such a great blend of both, because the more you actually experience these things, the more that you get that sort of, I call it cyber intuition, right? Where you have this idea of when you're looking through these logs, like, that seems anomalous. That doesn't seem like that should be there. And I think that's a great point. Um,
Yeah.
and I wanted to ask you a little bit, because we talked a little bit about the technical aspects of detection engineering, and we just recently had on another detection engineer, which opened my eyes too, right? Getting to hear different people's perspective in this field. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about the people aspect of this, and you sort of alluded to it a little bit when you're talking about, whether it's TTPs or, thinking about how, an actor might move. But can you talk a little bit about the people versus technical aspect of detection engineering?
Yeah, sure. um, yeah, well, what I'm thinking when you ask me this question, my first thought goes to, like, a detection engineer is serving a client. the client is who's ever responding to the alerts. They're the one who are doing the investigation. So in my mind, I'm like, when I'm writing a detection, I want to make sure I am contributing as much context and enriched information that that analyst, whoever's responding to it, has what they need to move forward with triage, what they need to know in exactly why this alert happened. So sometimes that's helpful in them having the alert logic, the condition of what satisfied the alert to begin with. Other times that's just having really good description of the alert, maybe in some kind of database where you keep track of all your rules, your rule set. It could also be making sure you have specific response instructions for that rule or that use case. Some of these rules fire all the time. Some of them may fire like once in a blue moon, and it's not always a rule that maybe a SOC analyst is going to be familiar with. And so ultimately, you're serving a client. The client is the person responding to those alerts, and I think making sure that their needs are met is number one. So that's kind of the people aspect I think of in terms of detection engineering.
Yeah, and I love the sort of the which we already talked a little bit about, but sort of how threat hunters, incident responders may work together, detection engineers. You start working with all these other teams in, maybe in cybersecurity, right? Like in these other areas, but you end up really working as a team because one person has a piece of information they might need to share with someone else and sort of get their input. And so it becomes this, working relationship, this iterative kind of approach that we see in, I know like the cybersecurity color wheel, and I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but like purple teaming, right? Where you have red teams that work with blue teams and bringing that feedback loop in. And
Yeah,
it feels a lot like that, right? That sort of that iterative approach, like, okay, let's keep working on this and building some of those protections in. Um,
yeah,
so to that point, can you talk a little bit about sort of the value of detection engineering, making a case for having detection engineers or a detection engineering, maybe even a program or a subset of a program for business leaders, how it, what some of the benefits are and how it can potentially maybe hopefully reduce incidents or find them, before they become a big issue.
yeah, certainly. We're all at the mercy of, in a way, at the mercy of our vendors, whatever vendor that is, for EDR, for WAF, for email gateways. I mean, whatever the technology is, you're highly unlikely not to have your own these days. And so keeping up with, in order for the vendor to keep up with the threat landscape is extremely difficult. And so I think that lending the vendor a hand, not necessarily a hand, but contributing to their rule sets in your own way that tailor to maybe possibly your own environment. Like maybe the vendor doesn't know where your crown jewels are, where your secrets are. The only way that you could protect your own network as securely as possible is going to be for you to come up with specific use cases to your own environment. And the vendors are doing as good of a job as they can, but they're at a 10,000 foot view. They're trying to meet the needs of all their clients, kind of at the same time, and they're casting a really wide net in terms of what they can deploy, what's going to be the biggest bang for our buck in our rule sets. If we see half of our clients are getting impacted by this threat, then yes, we're going to deploy some kind of rule for it. But if only one client is impacted by this threat because they've got some custom application in their environment and maybe it was vulnerable, they got compromised, maybe they're not going to spend the resources needed to write custom detections for that one client. So for any large organization, I think it's imperative to have detection engineers. Not only for the reasons that I just mentioned of making sure you're covering very specific aspects of your environment that a vendor might not be covering, but also you could potentially beat the vendor to detections that may come out several weeks later. If you have a pretty mature intel hunt detection engineering program, then you can consume this intel, do some attack simulation testing, see if you got coverage or not, and then write the detections and get them deployed to production well before a vendor could ever do this. So that's the main advantage.
Really bringing it to a proactive finding things, and not just proactive, but proactive and subjective, very, very much, what's in our environment, what do we need to look for, maybe based on industry. Because that's one thing that I see a lot too, right? Is that we don't always have industry based detection, right? So, like a hospital or a healthcare center is going to be affected differently than an academic institution. They're probably going to want different detection rules and looking for different types of actors. Um, so I think that's a really
Yeah.
good point. Um, well, and I wanted to ask you too, because one of the things I love to ask any of our guests that come on, because in your experience and in working as a detection engineer, I've come across some great resources. Specifically, the detection maturity level model by Ryan Stillians, I thought was really good. But do you have any resources, references, tools, anything like that for anyone that maybe is interested in getting into detection engineering or looking into it that they can sort of start with?
Uh, Specifics, I don't have anything specific. I would say that a lot of we learn tremendously from threat intelligence sources. Just your good, bleeping computer, Mandiant, all the really good sources that come out with threat reports. We learn from those, and oftentimes they'll come with some type of way to detect this, maybe a Sigma rule, Yara rules. Um, Even if it's like pseudo logic, that can kind of help you get started with writing your own detections. A lot of these rule sets do translate pretty easily. Sometimes they don't, and it requires a little more work to get it to bend to your exact technology that you've got in your environment. In terms of resources, online, there's a lot of really good GitHub repos out there that individuals in our community have been contributing to queries. They've been putting up hunting queries on GitHub. A lot of professionals have their own blogs, and they're posting, various hunts or detections that they've worked, maybe they've contributed a ton of time into, and they want to share it with the community, and they've got it out there. So we often do, instead of starting from nothing, we sometimes do, refer to Google and the internet to see if maybe this problem has been solved before. And if it has, even maybe in a little way, then that at least gives us a starting point, and then we can bend that detection or that hunt query to our specific needs.
Yeah, that's great. I know there's a ton of great stuff out there, and even on the vulnerability management side, right? Like chances are somebody, if I haven't looked at it, somebody's been looking at it, and I can at least get a good idea, a good starting place, and then build from there.
Yeah.
So that's great. Yeah. Well, before I take us to our last question, I had one more question that I'm interested with your experience and the things that you work on. What are like the top three threats, the top three biggest things that either you're worried about or you see in the industry, or things that you know keep you up at night, right? Like the three big things that you're worried about.
Yeah. I think we're going to share a common theme with the first one here. Misconfigurations is probably the first one. These uh, sometimes it's overlooked that you're spinning up some new application, asset, whatever it may be, infrastructure device, and you're trying to just get it out there and up so that the development team can begin working. And security is an afterthought. It's not a forethought, and unfortunately, um, that ends up biting us later, and even these misconfigurations, as sometimes they're not even at the fault of a developer, but it's kind of default stuff. And and there's some things happening right now with with our government enforcing some new controls around default um, credentials, default policies, applications when they're shipped from default with configurations, that now it's no longer acceptable to be having, default credentials like admin password, etc.
I'm
So
gonna
I think,
miss those, by the way. I'm
yeah,
joking. I'm not gonna joking.
right, right. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's number one, misconfigurations. Um, Number two, um, I would say, this is probably something that we have less control of, but it's education of our user base. A lot of times, compromises will happen because someone clicked on something they shouldn't have. They went to a website, download something they shouldn't have. They thought they were downloading a tool that does one thing, but it's actually Trojanized and it does another. We've seen APTs Trojanizing legitimate IT tools, and so even like the most technical individual who you would think would not be victimized by something like this, they download an SSH PuTTY client or type like a VNC client, and it's been Trojanized, unfortunately, and they end up getting the environment compromised. So that's number two, and then let me think. The third one that keeps me up at night. Um, yeah, I would just have to say it's vulnerability management and patching. You know, um, and that kind of it kind of circles back to number one. But I think we need to be in tune with patching and vulnerability management as best we can. And I know that's hard for smaller organizations, um, but it maybe just they need to reduce their attack surface. That could be a suggestion. Not have as many internet-facing assets. If it doesn't need to be plugged into the internet, then take it off. Put a WAF or proxy in front of it so that it's not directly accessible, and at least there's some level of control.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, vulnerability management is definitely it's one of the reasons why I got into, cybersecurity in the first place is just seeing how challenging patch management, secure configuration, all these things are for, small to large organizations. It can be really challenging. And I think part of that is just how complex our infrastructure is now. A lot of places have hybrid environments where they have cloud and still have some on prem, or they're in the middle of IT migrations or something
Mhm.
like that. And so they're in the middle of, moving, but they have to support multiple levels of OS while they're in the middle of those upgrades. And it just makes it incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
So that was, yeah, same thing. That keeps me up too. So that'll take us to our last question. And whatever spin you want to take on it, whether it's from your experience as a detection engineer, incident response, but what does cyber resiliency mean to you?
Yeah. Well, when I think of resilient, I'm thinking of like future proofing something. And in terms of engineering, detection engineering, we often do this in our rule sets. We're trying to think of like let's develop a rule or condition that is going to meet maybe a threat that we haven't seen before. So um, and not to get into the weeds here, but a lot of rule sets maybe are regular expressions, and so um, making the expression as wide as possible. Uh, without introducing maybe some benign hits. Like, so there's a sweet spot here. It's a balancing act. But that's what I think of resiliency, or at least resilient detections. And then resiliency, cyber resiliency itself, I'm thinking of like, how do we bounce back as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible from an attack or a compromise, whereas the environment is more secure than it was prior. And
Yeah.
that's where my head goes.
Yeah, perfect answer. Thank you. Well, I wanted to say a huge thank you, Chris, for joining me today. We talked about all things detection engineering, threat hunting, incident response, tooling, and rules. So thank you so much for joining me today. That's going to take us out for this week. Thanks for everybody for joining, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for having me.